Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and you are on the Varietal Literature YouTube channel. We also have a webpage, varietal-literature.ca. Why would you go to a YouTube channel? Why would you go to a webpage when you have a YouTube channel? Well, because we have a bunch of short stories from Vancouver writers, experimental fiction, poems, choose your own adventures, if you remember those. All available on the website for free. So if you want to check that out, there are links in the description below that'll take you there. But what we're doing tonight is we are reading fairy tales, and we're reading them together in our cuddly little fireplace here. And this is particularly suited to sort of chilling out after a long day of work, or while you're cooking, or just lying on the couch. There isn't anything specifically overtly visual, so if you just want to listen to it, it works very well for that as well. And tonight, the fairy tales we're going to read are from Iceland. We're reading Icelandic fairy tales, which are coming from this book that you see on my screen right now. Here. And if you want to read this book for yourself, of course, Project Gutenberg is where we get our books, which are books in the public domain, which means that it's an older book, and as a result, may have things that there might be better versions of it nowadays, right? So always hard to say. And I see GS and Holly's house are in the chat. Hello, GS, and hello, Holly's house. So, as per usual, if you've never been here before and you're not watching this live, then check in the description below, and there should be timestamps that tell you when certain stories start and when, when this talking at the beginning is done, if this isn't your vibe, or you just want to listen to one specific story or something, check for timestamps below when we're not live, and you'll be able to, oops, sorry for your headphones, and you'll be able to jump to whatever it is you want to watch. We're going to read two stories tonight. One is called The Legend of the King's Three Sons, and the other is just called Helga. The Legend of the King's Three Sons is the longer of the two. It is practically three stories, just in sequence. And regarding the title, Princesses Saving Princes, both stories have elements of, if not exactly that, elements of, as the foreword to this book points out, the princesses or the female characters doing the sort of labors that in other fairy tales are usually given to the princes, right? And it's interesting to me because the writer of this book seemed to think it was like wholly unique to Iceland, or at least that's the implication of how they wrote it. But it's really not if you've watched this series before, especially in the last month where we've been doing a lot of kind of Nordic tales from Northern Europe. Iceland, of course, is Nordic folk that came over from Northern Europe, so they fall into that same sort of pool of influences, though obviously Iceland is very unique, being an island, being relatively distant and isolated for much of its development, but it definitely brought over influences from places like Norway and Sweden and so on. So, but you'll notice that the Nordic tales and even the Scottish tales, which are heavily influenced by Nordic tales as well, because there's just basically a little bit of water between those two places, tend to have a lot more gender parity in how the stories get told. Like, there is definitely a strain as you start to get further south in Europe, and I really have no insights as to why this is. But in the stories that we've read that start to move when you move further south, where there's a lot more defined and rigid, men do the work and women do this, and woman's a little silly and the man's a little wise. Like there's that kind of divide starts that you would expect if you sort of only knew, I guess, Disney-esque fairy tales, the ones that Disney would at least adapt. But we notice that when you go into the more Nordic regions, it's a coin flip as to who's going to be the one doing the heroism, right? And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to read two stories where, yes, there are princes, and yes, they do things of, noble nature, but really the ultimate tying influence and the ultimate like narrative push and conclusion comes from the actions of the female characters in the story, which is only interesting in the sense that it's not that common in other fairy tale traditions. Like it's not like groundbreaking, I think, to any of us in this era, but it certainly is interesting if you grew up in some of the other places we've read stories from, where that just basically never happens. I don't really have anything more to build on that. I don't quite know. I'll leave it to anthropologists or whatever else to figure out what it is that influences that. I just find it interesting as a story. And that's what we're doing here. We're having fun with narrative and we're looking at stories. Okay, that's enough of me blabbing. I appreciate your patience. As per usual, it will be paid off by stories. So, as I said, our first story, The Legend of the King's Three Sons, is our longer, more kind of epic, involved story. It's a story where it's hard to know who the protagonist is going to be because it does sort of shift focus a few times. Similar characters throughout, but some just disappear. So that's Legend of the King's Three Sons. That's the first story we're reading. And the second one we're reading, Helga, is a shorter story that has shades of like Cinderella to it. It's that kind of tale, but very unique in its telling and a lot more contained and less magical. Okay, so I was gonna add something and now I can't think of what it is, and it doesn't matter. Let's look at our first story then. The Legend of the King's Three Sons. So yeah, this is our longer story. You'll get to sort of the theme of this video in the third act is where it kind of comes to bear. And also, everybody out there who is watching and who is wants to join in the chat, let me know what, if you've been watching this for a while, what stories have stood out to you? Like, what are stories that, we've read a lot of stories at this point. We've been going for almost a year. What are stories that you keep coming back to mentally that, like, you're like, oh, that was a fun tale? For me, it was actually a fairly recent story, and I think I'm going to work it into a story I'm thinking of writing. I don't really have a plot yet, though. Which was the story of the two brothers who meet a man in the forest with 2 swords and 6 dogs, who is a mysterious figure and gives them each a sword and each 3 dogs. And something about that really stands out for me. That's the one where he goes and kills the sea monster and so on. I think that was mid-January we read that. Okay, so I'll do my part now. This is The Legend of the King's Three Sons from Icelandic Fairytales, which you can read on Project Gutenberg. In olden days there once lived a king and a queen. They were wise and good, and their kingdom was known far and near as the happiest and best governed country in the world. They had 3 sons, Osric, Edric, and Frithjof, all handsome and brave and greatly beloved by their parents. But having no daughter, the king had adopted his little orphan niece, Isolde. She grew up with his sons and was their best-loved playfellow, both the king and queen making no distinction between her and their own children. As the princess grew older, she also grew fairer. Till when she was 16 years old, there was no maiden in the land so beautiful and sweet as Isolde. All 3 brothers fell in love with her and wanted to marry her, each in turn asking his father for her hand in marriage. If I could pause for a minute. One of the things that they said in the foreword for the Icelandic fairy tales, she admits that she censors these for kids for, questionable content. I don't know for sure, but I kind of suspect that she might actually be a relative in the original tale, because that was not necessarily a no-no. but that's just a completely baseless theory. But it's something also I want you to be aware of, is that this work is maybe not the original tales, but I really couldn't find as thorough accounts of the original tales, uncensored. Now the king was greatly puzzled what to do, for he loved his sons all equally well. So at length he decided that the princess should choose for herself, and select the one she liked best. He therefore sent for her and told her that she was herself to choose as a husband whichever of his sons she liked best. "It is my duty as well as my pleasure to obey you, dear father," said Isolde. "But when you tell me to choose one of the princes as my husbands, you give me a difficult task, for they are all equally dear to me." When the king heard these words, he saw that his troubles were by no means at an end. So he thought for a long time how he could best find a way that would satisfy all parties, and at last decided to send all 3 sons away for a year. At the end of that time they were to return, and whoever had succeeded in bringing back the most precious and valuable thing from his travels should receive the hand of Isolde as his reward. The 3 princes were quite willing to accept these terms, and arranged among themselves that at the end of the year they would all meet at their hunting lodge, and thence go together to the king's palace with their gifts. So bidding farewell to their parents and Isolde, they started off on their different journeys. Osric, the eldest son, traveled from city to city and explored various foreign countries without finding anything precious enough to take home. At last, when he had almost given up all hope, he heard that not very far from where he then was, there lived a princess who possessed a wonderful telescope, which was so powerful that one could see all over the world with it. No country was too distant. And not only could one see every town, but also every house and tree, and even people and animals inside the houses. "Surely," thought Osric, "no one can find a more precious or valuable thing than this glass, for nothing is hidden from it." So having arrived at the castle where the princess dwelt, he told her the object of his journey and asked whether she would sell him her telescope. At first the princess said she would not part with it, but when Osric told her how much depended on his taking back so valuable a gift, she consented to let him have it for a very large sum of money. The prince did not mind this. He only thought the gold well spent and hastened homeward, full of hope that he would secure the hand of Isolde. Prince Edric fared much the same as his elder brother. He also traveled about in distant countries, seeking in vain for something rare and precious to bring home. At last, when the year was nearly at an end, he reached a large and populous town, and in the inn where he lodged he met a man who told him that in a cave outside the town there lived a curious little dwarf called Voland, who was famed for his rare skill in all kinds of metalwork. "Perhaps," thought the prince, "he might be able to make me some rare and costly article worthy to take back." So he went to the dwarf, but when he told him what he wanted, the dwarf said he was very sorry, but he had quite given up working in metals. "The last thing I made was a shield," he continued, "but that is many years ago now. I made it for myself, and I'm unwilling to part with it, for not only is it almost the finest bit of work I ever did, but it also has some very special properties." "And what are these special properties?" asked the prince. "Well," replied the dwarf, "it is not only a perfect safeguard in battle, as no ordinary sword or arrow can pierce it, but if you sit on it, it will carry you all over the world, through the air as well as across the water. But there are some old runes or ancient letters carved on the shield, which he who guides it must be able to read, but I will show it to you." So saying, he went to the back of the cave and brought forth a beautiful shield, worked in gold, silver, and copper, the runic letters being all formed of precious stones. When Edric saw the shield and heard of its wonderful properties, he thought it would not be possible to find anything more rare or valuable. He therefore told the dwarf how much depended on his bringing back so precious a gift, and entreated him to let him purchase it. And he was so importunate? I don't know why I've gone blank on how to say that. I know the word. And urged him so strongly that although loath to part with it, when the dwarf heard how much depended on his securing so rare a gift, he agreed to sell it to him for a large sum of money. He also taught him how to read the runes, and Edric, thanking him for consenting to part with his shield, started on his homeward journey, filled with hope and confidence that he must win the princess's hand. Frithiof. Actually, I'm going to have some water first. GS says, especially in Iceland where they are remote, not a lot of options. I'm assuming that's about the sibling thing. Yeah, that was a thought for me as well. That's not unusual for kind of contained small populations. I think it's still an issue. I'm not sure if it's Iceland I'm thinking of, but I know that there is a specific dating app for a small community that was designed to make sure you're not accidentally dating a close relative. So that's a real thing. So, I mean, it's entirely possible. Frithiof, the youngest son, was the last to start. He determined to travel through his own country first. So he wandered about from place to place, stopping in this town or in that village, and wherever he met a merchant, or hoped to find anything rare or beautiful, he made most searching inquiries. All his efforts, however, proved fruitless. The greater part of the year had already passed, and he was still as far as ever from his goal. He almost began to fear that no success would crown his effort. Thanking him for consenting to part with his shield, started on... Oh, sorry. No, it didn't advance. There we go. I'm just max headroom. I just read them. At length he arrived at a large and populous town where a big market was being held, and numbers of people from all parts of the world came thronging in, some to buy and some to sell. So he followed the crowd and then went on from stall to stall, and from one merchant to another, inspecting their wares and chatting and asking for news. But though there were many beautiful and curious things, nothing especially struck his fancy. At length, tired and thirsty, he sat down beside a large fruit stall. The merchant, seeing as he thought, a likely customer, came forward asking if he would not buy something, offering him grapes, peaches, pineapples, and melons in turn. But Frithiof shook his head. None of these tempted him. For on the very top shelf he saw a magnificent crimson apple, streaked with green and gold, lying on a soft bed of moss. "I should like that apple," said the prince, "and do not mind what I pay for it. It is the only thing that I fancy, though all your fruit is splendid." The merchant smiled and shook his head. "You have a quick eye," he said to the prince. "For that apple is indeed the rarest and most valuable thing I have. But it is not for sale. It was given to one of my ancestors, who was a great doctor, by a genie, who has the particular power that if it is placed in the right hand of anyone who is sick, no matter how dangerous the illness, they recover at once. Aye, even if they are at the point of death. And many a life it has saved." When the prince heard this, he wished more than ever to possess the apple. Yeah, no kidding. It's not exactly dissuading. He felt he could not possibly find anything that the princess, who was so kind-hearted, would value more than the possession of this apple, which would enable her to do good to others. He therefore entreated the merchant to let him buy the apple, and when the man heard his tale and all that depended upon his bringing back such a rare and precious gift, he sold the apple to the prince, who, filled with hope, now wended his way homewards. And so it happened that, as they had arranged, the three brothers arrived at the hunting lodge outside the capital, and after they had related their adventures, Osric, the eldest, said, "Now let us hasten to the palace, but before starting I should like to see what the princess is doing." He thereupon drew forth his telescope and looked in the direction of the palace, but no sooner had he done so than an exclamation of terror escaped his lips. For there on the couch lay the princess, white and still as the driven snow, while beside her stood the king and queen and the chief of the courtiers in a sorrowful group, sadly awaiting the last breath of the fair Isolde. When Osric beheld this grievous sight, he was overwhelmed with grief, and when his brothers heard what he had seen, they too were overcome with sorrow. Gladly would each have given all they possessed to be back in time, at least to bid her farewell. Then Prince Edric remembered his magic shield, which would at once carry them to the king's palace, and bringing it forth, the three brothers seated themselves on it. I don't know how big this shield is. And the shield rose up in the air, and in a few seconds they had reached the palace, hastened up to the princess's chambers, where they found all the court assembled, sadly awaiting the end. Then Frithjof remembered his apple. Now was the time to test its power. Stepping softly up to the couch, he bent over the still white form of the princess and gently placed the apple in her right hand. Immediately a change was visible. It seemed as if a fresh stream of life passed through her body. The color returned to her lips and cheeks. She opened her eyes, and after a few minutes, she was able to sit up and speak. The general rejoicing at the princess's wonderful and unexpected recovery, and at the happy and opportune return of the three princes, can be better imagined than described. I should use that in a book. What a cop-out. But as soon as she was quite well, the king, mindful of his promise, called together a great thing, or national assembly, at which brothers were to exhibit the treasures they'd brought back, when judgment would be pronounced. The first came the eldest brother, Osric, with his telescope. This was handed around for people to see, while he explained its strange, marvelous properties, stating how by means of this glass he had saved the princess. For he had been able to see how ill she was. He therefore considered that he had earned the right to claim the princess's hand. Then Edric, the second brother, stepped forward and showed the beautiful shield that he'd gotten from the dwarf, and explained its peculiar power. "Of what use would have been my brother's glass," he asked, "without this shield which carried us hither in time to save her life? I claim, therefore, that it was really due to the power of my shield that the princess is not dead, and that I ought to, therefore, possess her hand in marriage." And now 'twas Frithjof's turn to come forward with an apple. He said, "I fear that neither the telescope which first showed us the princess was ill, nor the shield which so quickly brought us hither would have sufficed to restore the Princess Isolde's life and health, had it not been for the magic of my apple. For what good could our mere presence have done here? Our seeing her thus, and unable to help her, would only have added to our grief and pain. It is due to my apple that the princess has been restored to us, and I therefore think my claim to her hand is the greatest." Then there arose much questioning and reasoning in the thing as to which of the three articles were of the greatest value. But as they would come to no satisfactory agreement, the judges declared that all three articles were of equal value, for they had all equally contributed to restore the princess to life and health. For if one had been missing, the other two would have been valueless. So judgment was pronounced that all three gifts, being equally valuable, neither of the brothers could could claim the princess's hand. Then the king happily hit upon the idea of allowing his sons to shoot for the prize, and whoever was adjudged the best shot should wed the princess. So a target was set up, and Osric, armed with bow and arrows, stepped forth first. Taking careful aim, he drew his bow, and the arrow sped forth, but it fell some distance short of the mark. Then Edric stepped forward. He too took careful aim. His arrow fell nearer the mark, but still short. And now it was Fritjof's turn. He too took very careful aim, and all the people said his arrow went beyond the mark, and that he was the best shot. But when they came to look for it, behold, it could nowhere be found. In vain search was made in all directions. No sign of the arrow could be found. The king, therefore, decided that Edric had won the princess's hand. The wedding forthwith took place amid great splendor and rejoicing, and the princess and her husband then went to her own country, where they reigned long and happily. The eldest brother, Osric, greatly vexed that he had not been successful, started off on a long journey, and nothing more was heard of him. Straight up, that's it, that he's out of the story. I love old writing. So only the youngest brother was left at home, but he was not at all satisfied with the way matters had turned out, for he'd always been considered by far the best shot. He therefore searched every day in the field where the trial had taken place, looking for his arrow. At length, after many days, he found it lodged in an oak tree, far beyond the mark. He brought witnesses to attest the truth of this, and though there could be no question that his arrow had gone the furthest, the king said it was now too late to go into the matter, for the princess was married and gone away. Then Fritjof grew very restless. He thought he'd been unfairly treated, and at length decided to go away. So he packed up his belongings and, bidding his parents farewell, started off in search of adventures. Like I said, it's like 3 stories, so we kind of saw one. Now we're kind of in a second one, and there's even kind of a third one at the end. After passing along the wide plains that surrounded the capital, he climbed a high range of mountains, and from thence descended into a great forest. Here he wandered for about several days, but whichever way he turned, he could see nothing but trees all around him. The small store of food he'd taken with him when he started was exhausted, and tired and hungry and footsore, he sat down to rest on a large, flat gray stone, unable to proceed any further. He thought the end of his days had surely come, when suddenly he heard the noise of horses' feet. Looking up, he saw 10 men mounted on horseback coming rapidly towards him. They were all richly dressed and well armed, the last one leading a finely caparisoned palfrey. When they came to the prince, the leader dismounted, and bowing low before him, begged him to honor them by mounting the steed they brought with him. Fritjof gratefully accepted this offer, and mounting the horse, the party turned back the way they came, riding rapidly on till they arrived at a large town. Before entering the gates, they dismounted, the prince alone remaining on horseback, and then led the prince in state to the palace. Now it happened that a most beautiful young queen reigned over this province. She'd been left an orphan at an early age, her father entrusting his chief ministers with her care and responsibility of looking after her, and finding her a worthy husband. Queen Hildegard received the prince with much friendliness. She told him that her fairy godmother had bestowed on her the gift of seeing, whenever she wished, what happened in other countries. A wandering minstrel came here and told us the wonderful journeys you and your brothers made, and also of your sorrow at your failure in shooting competition for Princess Isolde's hand, though you were the best shot of the 3. Then a great wish seized me to try and make you happy. So I followed your wanderings after you left your father's palace. And when I saw you, sad and tired,
resting on the great stone in my forest. I sent forth some of my knights to meet you and bring you back. And now, with the consent of my ministers, I invite you here to remain as my husband. You shall rule over my kingdom, and I will try as far as lies in my power to make you forget all the trouble and anxiety you have gone through."
Frithiof was charmed with the beauty and kindness of the maiden and gladly consented to share her throne. And very happy days followed for both of them. The wedding was on the most magnificent scale, and after they were married, Frithiof, according to the custom of the country, took the reins of government in his hands amid the general rejoicing of the people, of course. It's always like, "Yay, a stranger, come lead us." "And now we must return to the old king." So you see how, there's a second story there about Frithiof, but it does actually connect to this last story. Like I said, it's long and there's 3 stories. "And now we must return to the old king," so his father. "Soon after his youngest son had gone away, the queen died, and the king, well advanced in years, felt very lonely and dull. One day, seated beside the great open earth, in the big audience hall, a peddler woman entered and displayed her wares before him. She told him her name was Brunhilde. She had evidently traveled much, and amused the king with tales of where she'd been and what she'd seen. When she was gone away, the king told her she might come again, which she did, day after day, till the king got so interested in her talk that he never was happy unless Brunhilde was with him, and at length he asked her to marry him and be his queen. In vain the chief ministers and courtiers dissuaded him from taking this step. The king was determined, though, and the wedding took place. No sooner had Brunhilde gained her object than she showed that she meant to be a real queen, not merely one in name. She always sat beside the king in council and interfered in all state matters. He would do nothing without consulting her, and no matter how wrong or unfair it might be, he always did whatever she wished. One day she said to him,
"It seems very strange to me that you have never made any attempt to recall your son, who went away. Why, only the other day we heard that he had become king of a neighboring country. You may depend upon it that, as soon as he's got a sufficiently large army, he will come back here and will attack you here, in order to revenge himself for the fancied wrong he imagines was done him in the trial of skill for the princess's hand. Now, take my advice. Call out your army. Attack him first, and so ward off the danger that threatens your country."
At first the king would not listen to what the queen said, and declared she was only frightening herself for nothing. But Brunhilde brought forward fresh arguments each day, till at length the king thought she might be right, and asked her what he'd better do, so that the prince should not suspect anything.
"You must first send messengers to him with presents," said the queen, "and invite him to come and see you, so that you may arrange with him about his succession to the throne after your death, and also to strengthen the friendship and neighborly relations between your two countries. After that, we will consult further."
The king thought her advice very good, and at once sent messengers laden with presents to his son. When they arrived at Prince Frithjof's court, they told the young king how anxious his father was to see him and hoped he would make no longer tarrying in coming to visit him. Frithjof, greatly pleased with the handsome gifts his father had sent him, at once agreed to go and hastened to make all preparations for his journey. But when Queen Hildegard heard of it, she became very anxious and entreated her husband not to leave her.
"I feel that some danger threatens you. that you may even lose your life, she said.
But Frithiof laughed at her fears. Oh, sorry, that's his wife. That's not the king's wife. I'm sorry, it's the other king's wife. Let's redo that.
I feel that some danger threatens you, and that you may even lose your life, she says.
But Frithiof laughed at her fears.
Surely you do not think my father would entreat me to come to him if he meant to deal wrongly with me? No, no, dear wife. Set your heart at rest, and have no fears. I will make but a short stay.
And so saying, he bade her a fond farewell, and started off with the messengers, arriving after a short journey at his father's court. But instead of a warm greeting promised him, to his surprise the king received him but coldly, and began to reproach him for being so undutiful as to go away.
It was most unfilial behavior, broke in the queen, and caused such grief to your father that he's nearly at death's door. And had anything happened to him, your life would have been forfeit, according to the laws of the land. As, however, you have given yourself up willingly, you have come here when he sent for you. He will not condemn you to death, but he gives you 3 tasks to perform, which you must accomplish within the year.
It was in vain that Frithiof declared that he never meant to vex his father. The queen would not let the old king speak, and said the only way Frithiof could save his life was to carry out the tasks his father had set him, which were as follows. First, you must bring a tent large enough to seat 100 knights, and yet so fine and thin that you can cover it with one hand. Secondly, you must bring me some of the famous water, which cures all sicknesses. And thirdly, you must show me a man who is utterly unlike any other man in the whole world.
And in what direction must I go to find these rarities?
Asked Frithiof.
Nay, that is your affair,
said the king. When Brunhilde, taking his arm, led him away into his own chamber, and Frithiof, without other farewell, sorrowfully returned to his own kingdom. On his arrival, Queen Hildegard hastened down to meet him, and seeing him looking sad and silent, asked him anxiously how he had fared at his father's court. At first, Frithiof, not liking to frighten her, tried to put her off, and made light of the scant courtesy shown him, but Hildegard, kneeling down beside him, taking his hand in hers, entreated him to conceal nothing from her.
I know you've had some difficult tasks given you, which will not be easy to perform. But do not lose heart, my dear husband. Tell me all, and then we will see if there's some way cannot be found to carry them out. A thing bravely faced is half accomplished, and it is not at all impossible with my kind godmother's help. I may be able to aid you. Tell me, therefore, what makes you so anxious?
Then Frithiof, taking heart, told Hildegard of the difficult tasks that the queen had given him.
And if I fail to accomplish them within the year, I must forfeit my life, he concluded. This is surely your stepmother's doing, said Hildegard. She is a jealous, and I fear also a wicked woman. Let us hope she is not planning any further mischief against you. She evidently thought these tasks she gave you would be more than you could accomplish, but, fortunately, I can help you in some of them. The tent your father wants I happen to have. It was given me by my godmother, so that difficulty is disposed of. Then the magic water which you are to bring is not far from here. Nevertheless, it is not easy to get, for it is in a deep well inside a dark cave, which is guarded by 7 lions and 3 huge snakes. Several persons have tried to get in and fetch some of the water, but no one has ever yet come back alive. I might give you some poison to kill these monsters, but unfortunately, the water loses all its healing power if it is taken from the after the animals are dead. But I think I may nevertheless be able to help you to get it."
Queen Hildegard then sent for her cowherd, and he and his 2 assistants drove 7 oxen and 3 great boars to the mouth of the cave. Here the animals were killed, and the carcasses thrown down before the lions and snakes. Then, while the monsters were gorging themselves with the carcasses of the dead animals, the queen told Frithiof to lower her quickly down the well. She provided herself with a large crystal jar. This she immediately filled with the water, and when Frithiof drew her up again, so exactly had she timed it that they were both reached the mouth of the cave, just as the lions and snakes were finishing the last morsels of their meal. Thus the second task was safely accomplished, and Frithiof and Hildegard hastened back to the palace.
"The 2 first tasks are happily ended," said Hildegard. "But the third, and most difficult one, remains still to be done. And this you must carry out by yourself. All I can do is to tell you the best to set to work about it. You must know that I have a half-brother called Rander. He lives on an island not very far from here. He is 9 feet high, has 1 big eye in the middle of his forehead, and a black beard 30 yards long, and as hard and stiff as pig's bristles. He also has a dog's snout instead of a mouth and nose, and a pair of green cat's eyes. In truth, it would be impossible to find another creature like him. When he wants to go from one place to another, he swings himself along by means of a great pole 50 yards long, and in this way he almost seems to fly through the air like a bird. The island on which he lives forms about 1/3 of my father's kingdom, and my brother thought he ought to have had a larger share. Then also my father had a wonderful ring which my brother wished to keep, but this also fell to my share, and since then my brother has shut himself up in this island. Now, however, I will write to him, enclosing the ring he always coveted. Perhaps that may dispose him to be more friendly to us. Well, we may get him to go to the king's court. For I know no one else who could so well fulfill the third task given you, in case you've forgotten, a man like no other. Now therefore you must go to him, accompanied by a large following of knights and squires, for that will please him. When you come near his castle, take off your crown and approach his throne bareheaded. He will then stretch forth his hand, and you must bend your knee and kiss it, and then hand him my letter and the ring. If after reading it he tells you to rise and seat yourself beside him, we may hope that he will aid us, and now good luck attend.
Holly's House says Rander is Icelandic for Rory. Well, that would be interesting if that's the case. Rory is an Irish name. The story's not done, but Rory is an Irish name with an insane spelling in English lettering. That means Red King. Frithiof followed the queen's instructions exactly. When he arrived at the Three-Eyed King's Palace, both he and his attendants were greatly startled at the frightful ugliness of the three-eyed monarch, but quickly recovering himself, Frithiof handed him Hildegard's letter and the ring. When the giant saw the ring, he seemed greatly pleased, and said, "I suppose my sister wants my help in some important matter, that she sends me so valuable a present." He then bade Frithiof to sit down beside him, and having read his sister's letter, he said he was quite ready to help carry out her wishes. He then stretched out his hand and grasped the long pole that always rested near him, and in an instant he had swung himself out of sight. In other words, he pole vaulted away. I found that description a little confusing when I read it earlier. The king feared at first that Rander had gone away altogether and left them, but a loud shout told them that he had only gone in advance, and thus they went on, the giant waiting for them every now and then. And when they reached him, scolding them well for being so slow and dilatory, In this way, they at last arrived at the queen's palace, and Randor at once asked Hildegard what it was she wanted him to do. The queen told him that Frithjof's father had required of her husband what he had required of his husband, and begged her brother to accompany Frithjof back to his father's court. Randor, greatly pleased at having at last got the ring he so much coveted, declared himself quite ready to do as she desired. So they started off at once for the king's old palace, which they reached without any further adventure. The history of my name is still going on. Hollyhill says, Rory was an 11th century king. Yes, he was. He was a king of Ireland. Frithjof announced his rival to his father, but though he informed him that he had obtained the 3 things required of him a year ago, he carefully kept Randor in safe hiding until his presence should be required, and asked that a thing might be called together in order that he might show the people how he had succeeded in carrying out the tasks assigned him. So the old king issued a proclamation all through the land, and on the appointed day, so great was the interest and curiosity of everyone, from the king and his courtiers down to the very poorest laborers and herd boy, that there was hardly standing room in the great Thing Valley. Not sure why this storyteller doesn't just want to call it like an event area. Queen Brunhilda was furious at the thought of Frithjof should have been successful, but she still hoped that when the things were brought to light, it would be found that he had failed in something. The tent was produced first. When it was fairly set up, it was so large and roomy that 100 knights and squires easily found room inside. Yet it was so finely wrought that when closed, anyone could cover it with their hand. So all the people declared Prince Frithjof had fully acquitted himself of his first task. Then the prince brought forth the crystal jar with the healing water and handed it to his father. Queen Brunhilda, who was getting quite yellow with anger, insisted upon tasting it to see whether it was the right water and taken at the right time so as to not lose its healing qualities. But as she was quite well, no sooner had she tasted the healing water than she felt very ill, and had to take a second taste ere she was well again. So the second task was pronounced to have been successfully accomplished. "Now," said the king, "there only remains the third and last task, and that was the most difficult one. See that you have not failed in that." Then Frithjof sent for the three-eyed giant, whom he'd kept in safe hiding until now. When Randor appeared before the thing, springing into their midst by the means of his long pole, everyone, but especially the old king, started back in fear. They could not imagine how he'd got there, and thought he must have flown down from the skies. Never before had they seen so hideous a creature, but, not taking any notice of the crowd, Randor walked up to the queen, and placing the point of his long pole against her chest, raised her up in the air, then hurled her to the ground, when she fell down dead, crushed her, in other words, and was immediately transformed into the hideous old giantess she really was. Having accomplished this, Randor made his way out of the thing and returned to his island. Frithjof devoted all his effort to restore and nurse the old king who, through anxiety and fright, had nearly been at death's door. But a few drops of the healing water sprinkled over him quickly restored him, and being freed by the queen's death from all her wicked enchantments, he speedily recovered his former good sense, and found that all the faults he had thought his son guilty of were only the inventions of wicked Queen Brunhilda. The end. GS says, a pole vaulting Randor, how random. How random. Yeah, maybe that's just I mean, I know that was one way it still is a way to traverse, like, small waterways, so maybe that's how he gets from his island to, I'm assuming, Iceland, from one of its little islands on the outskirts, across the ocean, because he's a giant man, right? Maybe he just has a very big pole and doesn't need a boat. I think that might be the implication. Oh, wow. We don't have a lot of time. Well, I won't waste much time. I will say, like I said, that first tale is a long one. It really is 3 tales. Like, I think in certain structures of stories, I could see how that would have been broken into 3 separate tales. First of all, you know, like, do you even remember that there was a Princess Isolde at the beginning and the brothers were fighting for it? That there were 3 brothers because it just slowly became about Frithiof? Like, it definitely wanders a bit, but you know me. Well, you might not know me, but if you don't know me, I really like wandering tales. That's why I like fairy tales and folk tales. But let me know what you think of it. We'll sort of collect together at the end. I don't want to run out of time and not have a chance to read Helga. So Helga is our next story. It's a shorter story. It's not a really short story, but it is a much shorter story than the last one. It's about half the length at least. And it definitely has... This is one of my favorite things about shared folktales through many cultures. You get the shapes and shadows of stories you may have heard in your culture that sort of got shared but is told a different way. And I think you will see that with Helga. I mentioned at the beginning what story I think is influenced by it, or is being influenced in it, or is the influence on it, I think is what I'm trying to say. I don't really know what the timeline is on it, but see if you guys can figure out which one it is. Gia says the spin-off took over. Yeah, it's the Frasier of fairy tales. Okay, so... Iceland, is that a timely reference? No, it's not. I think Fraser has been on for like 20 years. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. Icelandic fairy tales is... this is Helga from Icelandic fairy tales. A Icelandic traditional story. An old man and his wife once lived in a cottage beside the sea, far away from any other habitations. They had 3 daughters. The eldest was called Fridgon, the second Olga, and the youngest Helga. Now, although the parents were not rich, owning only a few acres of land, man, have times changed, which they tilled themselves, Fridgon and Olga were treated as if they were princesses. They never did any work, but sat all day amusing themselves and decking themselves in any finery their father brought them home from the neighboring town. Whilst Helga, who was far more beautiful and clever than either of her sisters, was always kept in the background. She never shared in any pleasures that her elder sisters often enjoyed. No presents were ever brought home for her. But all day long, from early morning till late at night, poor Helga had to work and toil for the whole family, receiving nothing but sour looks, often accompanied by blows from her elder sisters. Now it happened one day that the fire of their hearth had been allowed to go out. Now I find this interesting. I will explain in a minute, but I find this interesting. Helga was busy working in the fields, and as they had to send a long way to fetch fresh fire, the old man told Fridgon she must go for it. At first, Fridgon grumbled, for she was trying to dress her hair in a new way, but then she thought a walk through the woods might be pleasant, so she started. Give me a second here. And a flyaway hair. Now, just to pause in case you're getting a little confused, because this is core to the story's mechanics, like why they're moving and what they're doing. What this means is they keep a fire going all the time, basically. And when it goes out, they go and get what will ultimately really end up being hot coals and carry them back in a container to keep their fire going. Which is interesting because I would have thought they would have just had a method to start it themselves, which maybe they do. I don't know how common this was, but this was a very interesting thing to me, so maybe it wasn't to you. But that's what Fridgon is being sent to do, is to collect up hot coals from a fire out of town and bring it back to their stove. After she'd gone some little distance, she came to a hillock and heard a deep voice say, "Would you rather have me with you or against you?" Fridgon, thinking it was some laborer or woodcutter, said she did not care in the least, and that it was very impertinent of him to address her, and went on to the cave whence they fetched their fire. When she got there, to her great surprise, she saw a big cauldron filled with meat boiling on the fire, and beside it stood a pan filled with dough, waiting to be made into cakes. We would probably know it as bread, but not a creature in sight. She's basically talking about, I think the Canadian equivalent would be bannock bread. I mean, yeah. Not so much cake as we know it. Sweet things. Fridgon, being very hungry after her long walk, stirred up the fire beneath the cauldron to make the meat boil quickly, and then began baking some cakes. But although she made one specially nice for herself, she let all the others burn so that they were quite uneatable. Then, as soon as the meat was cooked, she took a bowl from a shelf and filled it with all the best bits and sat down and made a good meal, finishing up with the cake. Just as she had finished, a big black dog ran up to her and began wagging his tail and begging for food. But Fridgon angrily gave him a slap, chased him away, and then the dog grew angry, and jumping upon her, bit one of her hands. Sorry, not off. Screaming with fright and pain, Fridgon jumped up, and in her hurry to get away, forgot all the fire she was to bring and ran home to tell her parents of what had happened. They were very sorry, both for her sore hand, which they had bathed and bandaged, and the lack of the fire. It was really very unfortunate, for that cave was the nearest place where they could procure some fire, as it was generally used by charcoal burners. So, though they were very unwilling to send Olga, who was their pet and favorite, she had to go, for they all feared that if Helga were sent, she might run away and never come back again. I like that the reasoning for this has changed. And then there would be no one whom to vent their bad tempers, or to do the work of the whole household. For did she not wait on father and mother and both her sisters? So it was decided that Olga should go. But alas, Olga fared even worse than her sister. She was so spoilt that she thought she ought to always have the best of everything. So when she reached the cave, she too helped herself to all the best bits of meat, and making a nice cake for herself, threw the rest of the dough on the fire. And when the dog came up to her and wagged his tail and sat up and begged for some food, Olga took up some of the boiling broth and threw it on him. That made the dog so angry that he jumped up and bit off the point of her nose. I'm on the dog's side, of course. And Olga ran home crying and screaming with only half a nose and no fire. This time the parents were quite beside themselves with anger and decided that Helga must go and fetch the fire. If she succeeded, well and good, and if not, why, the dog might eat her for all they cared, and it would be a good riddance. So taking up the big fire shovel, Helga went on her way to the cave, and as she passed the hillock, she too heard a voice saying, "Would you rather I was with you than against you?" To this question she answered, "A well-known proverb says there is nothing so bad, it is not better to have it on your side than against you. So as I do not know who you are who asked me this question, I'd rather that you were with me than against me." And hearing nothing further and seeing no one, Helga continued her way till she reached the cave. Here she found everything the same as her sisters had done. The cauldron was on the fire and the dough was ready for baking. But instead of thinking only of herself, Helga looked after the meat and saw that it was nicely cooked. Then, with great care, she made up the dough into cakes and never thought of taking anything for herself, although she was very hungry, for she had nothing to eat for her breakfast but some hard, dry crusts and a glass of cold water. Neither would she now help herself to any of the fire without asking leave of the owner of the cave. Feeling very tired after her long walk, Helga sat on a bench to rest. But she had hardly done so when she heard a loud rumbling noise. The ground began to tremble, and Helga, fearful that the cave might fall in, rose hastily from her seat. But as she turned to run out, she saw a big, three-headed giant standing at the entrance of the cave, followed by a large black dog. Helga was terribly frightened, but being fond of animals, she held out her hand and patted the dog. And she quite regained courage when the giant, in a kind voice, said, "You have done the work well, which you found waiting here. It is only right, therefore, that you should get your share. Sit down, therefore, on that bench and share my dinner. Afterwards, you can take home some of the fire you have come for." The giant then got a bowl from the shelf and helped Helga to some broth out of the big cauldron, carefully giving her the tenderest bits of meat. As he did so, the ground again began to shake and tremble, and fearful noises like claps of thunder frightened Helga greatly. But the giant in a gentle voice bade her to sit down beside him, and she finished her broth. Then the giant got up and gave her one of the cakes she had baked. But no sooner had she finished it than the ground began to shake and tremble. The thunder pealed, and flash after flash of lightning lit up inside of the cave. Helga got so terrified that she ran up to the giant for protection, and as she clung to his arm, the noises ceased. And as the darkness passed away, Helga saw that the giant had disappeared, and she was holding on to the arm of a handsome young prince. "Nay, do not be frightened," he said. "I can never thank you enough, dear Helga. For you have rescued me from the horrible enchantment the wicked fairy Gondomar pronounced on me at my birth. I am Torquil, the son of Osbert, who reigns in the neighboring island, but because of my father refused to marry Gondomar, and chose my mother instead, the wicked fairy condemned me to go through life a three-headed monster, until some young girl should, despite my frightful appearance, place full trust and confidence in me." I like that it's not love, exactly. It's trust and confidence. I really like that. As Prince Torquil said these words, he seated himself beside Helga on a stone thickly covered with soft green moss. Then Helga told him her history and why she came to the cave, and also the fate of her sisters who had gone to the cave on the same errand, adding that she must hasten back with the fire, else her father and mother would scold and beat her. "You shall not be ill-treated any more," replied Torquil. For he went to the back of the cave and presently returned, carrying a casket and a small bundle in his hands. "See, this casket contains golds and pearls and precious stones," he said. "You can give some of these to your sisters, but this," he placed the bundle on a stool, "you must wear under your own dress when you get home, and be very careful that no one sees it." So saying, he undid the bundle and unfolded a beautiful dress of cloth of gold, all worked with silver and precious stones. Helga could not repress a cry of admiration when she saw the lovely gown, and warmly thanked the prince for all his beautiful gifts. Torquil then filled her fire shovel with burning coals and carried it for her some part of the way home. But ere there came in sight of the cottage, he stopped, and taking her hand, placed a heavy gold ring on her finger. "Keep this ring, dear Helga," he said, "and let no one take it from you. It will not be long ere I come to claim my bride. But I must first return to my parents and tell them the joyful news that the wicked charm is broken at last." With these words he took a loving farewell of Helga, and started her on her homeward journey. When she reached the cottage, her parents saw that she had succeeded in bringing back the fire. Helga, for once in her life, received a kind word of welcome. But when she showed them the casket and was about to give her sisters some of the jewels, they seized upon it, dividing the contents among themselves, returned Helga the empty casket. They might also have taken away her beautiful dress, but after Torkil left her, she had taken precaution to slip it under her old gown, so no one knew anything about it. And thus some days passed on. Matters relapsed into their former way. Fridegon and Olga did nothing all day but deck themselves with the jewels out of the casket, quarreling and fighting over them, and Helga, as before, had to do the work for the whole family. When one day the mother, who had been to the higher meadow for some herbs she wanted, came back and said that she'd seen a big, beautiful ship lying at anchor on the shore below their cottage. The old man hastened down to the strand to find out who the owner of the fine vessel might be, and seeing a boat pulling from it, he waited till the stranger, who was a handsome young man, had landed, and then entered into conversation with him. But though he plied him with many questions, he could not find out his name. The young man in his turn began to question him and asked him how many children he had.
"Only 2 daughters," replied the old man, "and such good and beautiful girls they are, too," he added.
"I should much like to see them," said the stranger. The old man, greatly delighted, led the way back to his cottage, where his 2 eldest daughters had hurried on their best frocks and decked themselves with all the jewels out of Helga's casket. The stranger expressed himself as being very pleased with the girls.
"But why has one of your daughters got her hand tied up with a cloth, and the other one a handkerchief fastened across her nose?"
Did they really think they could sell that second one? At first, the father said that they'd met with an accident and slipped down the cliffs, but when the stranger pressed for further particulars, the story of the dogs and cave had to be told.
"But then surely you have another daughter," said the stranger, "one who I know is always kind to all animals."
At first, the old man and his wife both declared that they only had these 2 daughters. But when the stranger kept on urging him, he at last admitted that he had another girl.
"But she is so ugly, lazy, and wicked," he said, "that she is more like some wild animal than a human being."
But the stranger said he did not mind that at all, and that he must see her. So the old man was obliged to at last call Helga. The poor girl came out from the kitchen, dressed just as she was, in her shabby old dress. When the young man went up to her, and as he took her hand, the ragged old gown slipped from her shoulders, and there, to the astonishment and rage of her sisters, stood Helga, arrayed in the beautiful garment the prince had given her. Prince Torkil rated the old man and the 2 wicked sisters soundly for all their unkindness to Helga. He also made the sisters give up all the jewels they had taken from her, but Helga begged that they might be allowed to keep a few. And the prince consenting, she gave them each 2 chains, 2 brooches, 2 bracelets, and 2 pairs of earrings. Then Torkil led Helga down to the shore and took her on board his beautiful ship, where his sister gave her a kindly welcome. And when they reached his own country, King Osbert and his queen prepared a great wedding feast, and Torkil and Helga were married and lived long and happily together. And that is Helga, our second story. GS says, why can't he take her with him before he tells his parents? I know, and he says, like, your suffering's over, but then he's like, also, I gotta leave for a while. So I guess it's not Torkil. GS also says, how about some middle-aged girl? Yeah, I don't think that's going to be happening in any of these stories. Some things, maybe some places are more progressive than others, but that one, they're not that progressive. This has been, the Icelandic fairy tales. And, like, if the title gave you the impression that, like, we were going to be reading feminist literature about the liberation of women, I'm sorry if that was the impression. That certainly wasn't the impression I was trying to give. I was trying to show just a different type of story. And I think that these sort of meet that nature. They have all the familiar parts of a fairy tale, but are significantly more I'm trying to think of the right word for this. More egalitarian, not necessarily egalitarian. Holly's House says the original Cinderella was Asian in origin. Do you know if that's specifically Chinese or Indian or... Oh, Chinese, Holly's House says. If it is, I'm not familiar. There is obviously some cross-pollination at different times with different cultures, so it's not unheard of that stories should travel around in that way. And there were people that did nothing but, going all the way back to at least ancient Greece, people that would travel just to sort of gather stories. That's a thing. So, you know, it's not a thing that's so much anymore. They were kind of bards, kind of historians. Like, over time, they became more just basically bards. But yeah, traveling around, collecting stories and sharing it with other people and other cultures was a thing. So, I mean, the internet has pretty much made that not a job anymore. But sometimes I wonder if, like, genetically, I could trace my lineage back to some dork walking around telling stories on a trail. Because if you don't know, that's kind of the feel that we go for here. Anyways, I have taken too much time from everybody. It is over an hour, and we do try to keep it to an hour. Thank you, Holly and GS, for saying hello to me in the chat, keeping me company. Thank you to everybody else who doesn't use the chat, but does come and watch me regularly. I really appreciate you guys hanging out and listening to stories from me. I hope you enjoyed the Icelandic tales. Again, I don't say this too often, but there's a couple of things that help the video. Liking and subscribing. I mean, you've heard that before if you've ever used YouTube. But really what I'm interested in is telling stories to people who want to hear these stories. So if you think somebody might find this entertaining, like maybe not this one, maybe one of our other videos, even if that's the only one they ever listen to, it'd make me really happy if you could share it with somebody you think would like it. Holly's House says, that's why the story focused on the smaller feet and also thought the original slipper was made of fur. It's a mistranslation to glass in French. It's entirely possible. Like I said, there's really ridiculously similar stories between Japan and Ireland that fairy tales that I have no idea which way that genesis goes, because Irish culture's been around for a very long time, going back to Celtic and Gaelic cultures, but Celtic in particular, are very old, and as is Japan. So I don't know. I don't know who seeds what, but what I do find interesting is A, the way different cultures make it their own, and B, that stories are not intellectual property, they're cultural threads that tie us together across time and across space. That's what I like about stories. So thank you for coming here and letting me weave that cultural thread into you. That sounds violent. And thank you for watching Fireside Fairytales. If you like something sillier that involves some live writing, Thursday nights at 6:30. It's a little higher energy, a little bit goofier, but it's still writing. It's still stories. If you've got some idea that you want to come and see what a writer makes of it, that's the place you should be. Other than that, we got a ton of other videos in the playlist. We got a ton of other Fireside Fairytales you can watch if you haven't seen them, tied around themes and locations and just sometimes random nonsense. I think you should go and check them out if you enjoyed this. My name is Rory. This has been Fireside Fairytales. I hope you get a good sleep by the fire. I'll keep it warm for you.